Get going. Okay. Hello, everybody. Happy Friday and welcome to another Call to Work webinar. If you are watching back on YouTube, welcome. Thank you for being here. Please hit like, subscribe below, and check out some of our previous webinars as well. There's lots of really cool, interesting stuff from lots of really interesting people talking about various topics, but none of them as interesting as the webinar that we're going to go through today. Been excited about this, been planning it for a while. So today's topic is called to work in Africa. Incredible things happening in that incredible continent. And don't worry, I'm not expecting our speakers today to cover all of that. There's a lot to it, but we wanted to speak to a couple of really interesting speakers on that particular area. They've got their faith at the center of their journey. They're doing things over in that continent with connections here over to us, people in the west of the UK. So it'd be fascinating to catch up with these people, get to know them, and yeah, to see where the conversation takes us and see what we can learn and see how entrepreneurs in Africa and maybe over here in the UK can learn around what's going on from some of these folks over here. So I'm going to let the two speakers, we're speaking late at the moment, I think, but that's okay. That's the call to work way. We can bring him in when he comes in as well. But we'll introduce a couple of our speakers and we'll absolutely get started. So first of all, Aramide, can I pass to you? Can you introduce yourself? Can you say hello to everybody and tell everybody about you, who you are and what you're up to?
Okay, hi everyone. It's Aramide. Nice to meet you. It's a pleasure to be on here. Thanks to James and the rest of the team. What am I up to? Yes, so I work in the international development space. I actually live in Côte d'Ivoire, Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire, even though I'm Nigerian. I moved back to the continent. I moved away from the continent after high school in 1999. Studied in the UK and then worked in the UK for a bit. Moved back to Nigeria actually in 2008 and then moved away again for business school. So I've been in and out of the continent a fair bit. I have worked in the private sector in technology and then in banking, and then now I work in international development. So that is me in a nutshell. I am Christian, gave my life to Christ in 2008, and yeah, it's a pleasure to be here.
Fantastic. Amazing to get to hear your intro, and we'll be chatting to you again in a sec. Chia, can you give an intro to yourself as well, please?
Sure. I hope everyone can hear me loud and clear.
Loud
Thanks
and
for
clear.
having me.
Go for it.
Awesome. So I'm Chi. I grew up in Nigeria. I was born in Nigeria, grew up in Nigeria till I was about 16. And then I moved to the UK, went to university there, A levels, worked there for over a decade before I got called to move back home to Nigeria. Well, the UK is also home in many ways. I lived in Nigeria for a while and then work again took me abroad to the Middle East. And about 2 years ago, I moved back again to Nigeria. I have an almost 2-decade career in investment banking, in finance, as well as venture capital. And over the last 2 years, I have been pivoting more into the media space, so filmmaking and telling stories. I sit on the board of one of the largest banks in Nigeria as well, and spend a lot of time advising VC funds. I was born a Christian, so all my life I have been in the faith, but my journey certainly hasn't been linear. I have had periods that I've had a lot of questions, but yeah, I'm grateful to be here.
Hey, we're equally grateful for, so thanks for that. Look, you're both based in Nigeria and from there, so let's hone on that area. No disrespect to the rest of the continent, obviously, but let's kind of keep it topical here. It'd be really helpful and again educational, certainly for folks like myself and some folks here, like set the scene for us, if you may, in terms of Nigeria, the tech investment scene, people are building, people are investing. It seems like you both work in that area. Can you just sort of like paint the picture for us? Is where the scene, is it concentrated around cities? Is it forming? Like maybe if you want to go first, Chi, just talk about your depiction of the scene today so that you can set the picture for people over here in the UK.
Sure. Nigeria, for those who don't know, is one of the most populous countries, is the most populous country in Africa, but also one of the most populous countries in the world with over 200 million people. We like to call ourselves the giants of Africa. We like to believe that we are the giants of Africa. The South Africans may not agree with us or the Egyptians, but we like to think that because we are proud and boldly typically Nigerian. In terms of the investment community, it's thriving, it's bustling. There has been huge growth over the last couple of decades, just from a production point of view across the economy, actually. It has been volatile. It hasn't been completely moving upwards as every economy faces. But there's been a significant period of prosperity since we converted from a military into a more democratic government. And what we've seen over the past decade in particular has been, you know, since the democratization of access to the internet and to mobile phones, a lot of growth in innovation. So the VC space has been thriving. Again, the last few years maybe has been tough, but I think since the last couple of years, maybe 5 years ago, 4 years ago, it's been tough, but over the last 18 months or so, we've started to see more activity coming back, especially, I would say, in fintech. So I would say it's a thriving community. We also have, I think we're also one of the countries on the continent, more so I would say South Africa and Northern Africa, but also to a large extent Nigeria, that not only has seen huge traction around the product development and the entrepreneurial space, but also around capital deployment. We are starting to see a lot more interest locally as well in funding the venture capital space. So that's been exciting to see because it's definitely something that I personally have been advocating for, like less reliance on external capital and more inward-looking capital moving into the early stage space. So it's an exciting time to be here as a business person, I would say.
Yeah.
Sorry, you're muted.
Yeah. Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, thanks. I think she really hit the nail on the head. I'm not based in Nigeria. I am based in Côte d'Ivoire, which is Francophone Africa. But I can speak to not so much from the investing side, but generally the direction and the way things look. As she mentioned, Africa is, or well, I'll say Africa is in a defining moment. We are the youngest continent, as you probably know or have read. That means there's lots of opportunities for youth. There's a lot of innovation that is just, there's been a wave of innovation over the past 2 decades, like she mentioned as well. And so, yeah, it's rich in youth and innovation and untapped potential. Because I work in the development space, we've been able to identify a few areas or industries where there could potentially be gold mines, but it may take a while because of infrastructure gaps like agriculture, mining, manufacturing. As much as those present huge opportunities, they aren't where they should be in terms of sophistication, even investment as well. So you find that where the money goes into more easily and of course in terms of returns on investment is fintech, like Chi mentioned as well. So socially the tide is turning. There's also, I mean, you've witnessed the springs, the various Arab Springs. Even in Francophone Africa now, there's a whole revolution going on. So the tide is really turning. More leaders are rising with a sense of purpose, hopefully more responsibility at some point. But what really excites me the most is seeing believers now realizing that we're not just called to church alone and to the marketplace, to boardrooms, classrooms, the workplace, clinics, startups, farms. But if I could pick on an industry, and I was asked this last week in terms of where I see maybe like a whole gold rush coming from, I'll probably say agriculture, which is yet it's highly untapped. So I'll just maybe add that to the question.
Oh, incredible. Okay, well, let's come back to that because that's really exciting. And I think, like you both mentioned, fintech activity, things being built. Um, Let me chuck it back at you, maybe Chi first. Why do you think that is? Is that part of heritage? Like, why do you think there's a fintech adjacency that you're finding in the businesses that you're working with?
I would say that it's because fintech is is the core infrastructure of all other kind of commercial business. So any kind of business that you're trying to do, you need to be able to pay for it. And I think what has also helped, by and large, is a government policy that has also focused on pushing a cashless policy, which means that over the last decade, there's been a huge focus from a lot of African governments, not just Nigeria specifically, to say we want to push the country towards a cashless operations, because as we know, a lot of the African commercial business environment is actually informal, and that still very much exists. But part of what we're looking to do is one of the ways to track that and formalize that and get the data and include people into the social dynamics of the country is through payments. So I believe that that's part of why. And this payments, the fintech in particular, also includes a lot of cross-border, because what you have is a huge African diaspora outside of the continent. And there is a huge portion of our economy that comes from remittances. It's always, over the last, again, couple of decades, it's been touted to be more than $20 billion of flows in and out cross-border from, the US, Asia, Europe, even amongst the various countries in Africa. So in many ways, the fintech is the core infrastructure that we need for business. And I think that's a big part of the reason why it's been one of the focus areas, one of the most thriving, like Aramide said, also has had some of the highest return on investments. We've seen a lot of exits, a lot of traction. So it's the first step before, as we build other infrastructure like healthcare. As she mentioned as well, agriculture it's hugely important, because food safety, food security is very topical as well in and out of the continent. So what we hope to see is, as that continues to develop, more and more growth and interest in other areas, other sectors of the economy. You're on mute.
I know, I'm going to stop doing that. It's in case my kids come in. Aramide, do you want to maybe add anything that you're seeing from a fintech perspective, and maybe bring the question onto the agricultural point? Because I thought that was really interesting as well.
Yeah, so, and I mean, she has said everything really. Maybe perhaps one thing I've also noticed as I travel across Africa is how technology really enables that access to finance that people or the underbanked typically wouldn't have, which is why there's a huge growth. I think it was 50% customer acquisition or something like that. And even a fintech today could thrive because there's so many financial products that you can introduce, market opportunities for financial inclusion. Certain governments are now even, doubling up on and creating an enabling environment for finance or banking generally, and of course for fintech as well. In terms of agriculture, the intersection of agriculture and fintech is an interesting one. It's I've seen certain solutions come up where they've actually failed, because with regards to agriculture, you can't really determine yield with financial numbers. It's more or less with the weather and with nature. So when you see certain crowdfunding platforms come up and predict all these numbers and then they go bust, that has been the reason, I think, at least in my view. So I'm yet to see where there's been successful fintech, and there's probably a few, and maybe Chi knows more. But generally, in terms of the entire value chain of agriculture, they're still in basic production. So even in terms of processing, even manufacturing, and of course, even transportation, logistics, there's so many gaps. And so I mean, apart from growing crops, you can really steer the whole ecosystem and do more. So there's opportunities for creating more value, creating more jobs for sure, and really just driving that. And then also using technology, right? So the Internet of Things, AI, yeah. So using those for farming and in tech is still very nascent, and so that presents huge opportunities. And then there's a whole mandate now of ensuring that there's cross-border trade between countries. That's taken a while and it's still taking a while, but there's hope that with that, because it's very difficult to, first of all, trade across borders, even though we're on the same continent, and even travel as well. There's so many things, so many difficulties. So being able to eliminate that helps for ease of doing business, market expansion, market entry. And so that's what businesses are really looking to see. So again, I really speak to what the opportunities are, because there's huge gaps. We know so many countries. I mean, they say Africa is the richest continent in terms of raw materials and resources, and it is. But the question is how, apart from having this whole neo-colonization happen, where people are coming and taking resources, there could be even transfer of skills, and Africans begin to produce, process, and not just import, which has been a problem. So I'll probably just pause there.
Thanks for that. Yeah, I think you guys are setting the scene really well here, and I definitely want to go into sort of how your faith plays into the intersection of what you're doing. But I guess one more practical question around this is like, so for folks that are based here in the UK, for example, or maybe we're in the US, or lots tech will be galvanized around more city-based hubs, right? So London, San Francisco, places like that. Obviously, there's a huge tech scene in Israel, kind of like people congregating, getting together around a particular place and building off the fact that not all businesses, but historically, obviously with Silicon Valley. We're talking about a continent that's much larger and obviously different countries. And we're also talking about a culture. And again, you both gave examples about that, how you'd come over to here to go to education institutions, build networks, going back. Can you maybe sort of set the scene now, like how you connect with founders, how business networking works? Is it like larger events that people congregate to? Is it all online? Just maybe set the scene for some of the maybe the founders and the business builders here that are like being a lot more scrappy locally to sort of think about how they can actually build networks and do some of that stuff in with different logistical challenges. I don't know if Chi, you want to answer that one maybe first?
Sure. I think you are absolutely correct in that a lot of innovation is centered around the cities, is centered around the commercial capitals, because that's where a lot of the capital is, and a lot of the network is, and a lot of the access is. What we are seeing, however, and I can speak more specifically to Nigeria about this, because I'm a little bit less Nigerian, probably Kenya to some extent, or East Africa, I would say, which is that we are increasingly seeing growth. Because the thing is, with the internet, everybody has access to the internet. And what we're finding with a lot of the younger generation, who are the ones driving a lot of the conversation, a lot of the disruptive conversations around innovation and products, they can be based anywhere. They just need their laptop and access to the internet. So in Nigeria, for instance, there are hubs outside of the main cities of Lagos, and less so Abuja, but I would say Lagos and Abuja, that are known to have a thriving youth tech community. And in fact, some of the events historically would expect them to come to Lagos, but we're starting to see some roundtables at the very least, not large conferences, but roundtables happening in other cities like in Uyo, Calabar, in Enugu, in Ibadan, even in Osun State, which is less popular and glamorous, but still at least their proximity to Lagos, the commercial hub, helps. The same thing that I would say we see in Africa, in East Africa. If you go to Uganda, it's most likely Kampala. If you go to Kenya, it would be Nairobi. So people, the central point is still very much the main cities, and in particular the commercial cities, because many African countries, or many countries, also have political capitals that are often separate from the commercial capitals. But we're seeing that growth and that development in clusters across some other towns.
Got it. Okay. And that's what I would expect, right? It makes absolutely logical sense. And for you working in the finance space, to being able to connect with founders, that's obviously helpful, right? If they're clustered around. Is there different out in Côte d'Ivoire, Aramide, or similar?
Yes, so in Cote d'Ivoire, it's a little different because I mean, I think I'm even more embedded in the ecosystem, the startup ecosystem in Nigeria. Interestingly, there's actual hubs, and for the rural or less urban cities, they all seem to have hubs now. Also because every government now realizes when you have a youth mandate, you can't do that without technology and innovation. So that has allowed for there to be a springboard of hubs and workspaces which allow founders and budding founders to congregate at or get support or some sort of funding or be part of some sort of hackathon or competition. So that's happening almost across at least 25 states in Nigeria. In Cote d'Ivoire, it's a little different, but I'm seeing there's a few DFIs, development organizations, that are beginning to look outside of the capital, Abidjan, into other areas to drive greenpreneurship, which is the green climate and agriculture type entrepreneurship, because they realize that you can't just focus on only the capital. There's just so much that you can get out of developing the youth in other areas as well. So that's happening, and I imagine that that's happening across different countries as well. If I look at Liberia, Sierra Leone, the only thing is that every country, or each of these countries, are at different levels. In Liberia, for example, most of the youth get up to high school and then drop out. And so the focus there is on technical and vocational skills. So it's very different from country to country, which is why, like Chi was saying, when you think about maybe the more, where there's more of a concentration, even in terms of funding and development and advancement, it would be the Nigerias, the Kenyas, the South Africas, Egypts, maybe Senegal, because of the how advanced they are, or their focus on education. I mean, Nigeria has always had a very strong focus on education, and so tertiary and going to university, it just goes without saying. It's not so much an option unless there's issues like lack of access to finance, but there are government universities as well, or state-owned universities apart from private universities. In other countries, it may not be that. Like I mentioned, Liberia, which is very much, most of the youth want to focus on sports or work in government as opposed to go to university and get a formal job. So it's very different from country to country. And so it really depends, I'll say. But there is a push, especially, of course, in the more advanced countries, to ensure that apart from the capitals, which are sometimes even, like a lot of people say, oh, Lagos, I don't want to do this startup there. It's overcrowded because there's multiple people doing the same thing. And you find that with certain cities, right? Why not go to the exterior, or look in another country where you can then get immense growth. So yeah, so there's a bit of it depends on the country situation there.
You've both set the scene brilliantly there, certainly for context for people that are thinking about it. And anyone new that's joining, please introduce yourself in the chat so that you know that you're there. If you have questions that you want to ask our speakers towards the end, please pop them in the chat and I'll pick those up. That'll be super helpful so we can know who the audience is here, and that's fantastic. Okay, so switching up a little bit, and again, and maybe we'll start with you, Aramide. So this is a call to work community. This is a call to work webinar, and lots of the things that you've told us have been fascinating. But like, what would you define as being called to work? How do you bring the mission and your background into what you're doing with your work on a daily basis? It'd be fascinating to find out about that.
Interesting question. I don't know that I realized anything about being called up until maybe a few years ago. You're just kind of going with the flow, wanting to achieve, or maybe even run this rat race, as they call it. And then maybe you begin to realize that, sorry, it's a bit of a noise in the background. You begin to realize that, okay, maybe there is a frustration that you tend to see and want to solve for, and with knowledge and reading and networking and engaging with people, realize that maybe that's part of your purpose, which is why you get that frustration when you've come across these things. So that's something that I maybe identified in the past maybe 3, 4, 5 years, and I realized, oh, okay, so maybe this is part of a calling. And for me, that was always maybe connecting people or helping someone access a certain type of opportunity or a job or funding, whatever it is, but by virtue of information or a network that I've had. So being able to articulate that as a calling was in a journey in itself, because even when I was in it and I discovered it, I didn't really see it as a calling. But maybe being called to work is more than just pursuing a career. Now, in hindsight, I can say it's really accepting an assignment, in a sense, to serve, to build. And I don't necessarily also believe that it's about maybe ministry exclusively or work exclusively. I do believe that you can bring the two together. And so it's bringing God's values into your work. There's people who aren't believers, but they respect you because you work with integrity, you lead with integrity, you put your heart into what you do, you have a spirit of excellence, and that could even be evangelizing. So it's a tricky one, but I think it's really understanding that your vocation, whatever it is an extension of worship in a sense, if you want to call it that. So that's my understanding of being of what called to work is, or maybe called to work in Africa is.
Yeah, I think it's a wonderful answer. And again, I think it probably doesn't have a specific African version of the answer, right? But but what's fascinating is to hear your perspective and your journey. And what I really appreciated you saying there is that, look, an endeavor to try to be Christ-like in the way that you work. And, Matthew 7, by their fruits they'll know you is a shared thing that we find across these communities, right? And again, it's wonderful that you have the opportunity to help with these incredibly important projects, such as, infrastructure and agriculture and things that are required in the continent. But, on a daily basis, we can all help with that impact. So, it's a wonderful answer, and thank you for sharing that. Chi, how about you?
So I'm gonna respond the same way Aramide did in terms of what is being called to work before and then specifically in Africa. So there's some similarities, but also differences in our journeys. So when I was younger, I was obsessed with what is my purpose? Where am I meant to be? And that is how I defined being called to work. Every little detail, God, am I supposed to work here? Am I supposed to go here? Should I be friends with this person? Should I meet this person? I was really genuinely obsessed with wanting to know every step in a way before I moved. But I feel now like my journey has kind of evolved. I think that it's important to always be prayerful and ask for God's guidance, but I think perhaps I was a little bit too obsessed with knowing every single step before I moved. I think the way my journey has evolved now is God's being called to work is the same way I approach being called to do anything in my life, which is what is God's will and what is the truth of the gospel in whatever it is that I'm choosing to do. Now, that's a lot of Christian lingo. So how do I interpret that? God's will in whatever it is that I'm being called to work to do is what is my why? What is my motive for whatever I do? How do I justify whatever I do to him? And also being mindful of the fact that God's will or God's calling for all of us is about people, not necessarily always a specific place. Yes, sometimes God will tell you, leave this place and move to the land of Canaan, or leave this place and go here. But sometimes it's not about where it is that you're going to go. It's about who it is that is coming to meet you or is going to meet you, or who you're going to come across with in your journey. So I'm a little bit more, so it's almost like it's the reverse, right? Where Aramide said she used to kind of just go with the flow, and now she's found, for me, it's more like God was taking me on this journey of stop obsessing so much about the little details that sometimes you miss what I'm calling you in the bigger picture. So that's how I think about being called to work now. In terms of being, but at the same time, every platform I have, I am mindful again of asking myself, what is the truth of the gospel here? In terms of being called to work in Africa, I think for me, it is feeling this responsibility, this divine calling to be part of the change that I want to see. And to be set apart in terms of showing that commercial success and Christian values can coexist. And also just not becoming part of the very problems that we see and that we can complain about. And that may sound trivial, depending on who's listening, but it manifests even in the tiniest ways. So for example, you go somewhere, there's a queue, you know that you can maneuver your way to the front of the queue. Should you maneuver your way to the front of the queue? Sometimes it makes sense for you to queue. No, well, all the time it makes sense for you to queue, I should say. But what I mean is that certain times that in an environment like this, certain privileges make it easy for you to forget that in using those privileges, you become a part of the problem. And so I'm constantly mindful of the fact that I want to be the change that I want to see. And I'm constantly representing the truth of the gospel in everything that I do.
Interesting. Okay, and thanks for that. And maybe Chi will maybe stick with you on this. And can you set the scene for us, like Christians in your workplace, prominent, vocal about their faith, like because again, like over here in the West and certainly in the UK, and I would say in across organisations, what we're finding is, organisations are building, and we've had this webinar talking about this, where some of the largest organisations are supporting Christian associations. But I would say that it's certainly far from the mainstream. In amongst your organisation and community, open Christians, church talked about openly. It's kind of like you get that type of support. Like maybe set the scene for us within your business and your organisation.
Sure. So that's a very, very interesting question that I will preface by saying that most of my work experience and corporate experience is actually more in the West than it is in Nigeria. So I have become more accustomed actually to a work environment where the Christian identity or the Christian faith isn't necessarily as openly talked about, because that was my experience working in large corporates in developed markets. However, Nigeria is naturally a very religious country. So I think that what we find is that it's very religious, and the two almost equally dominant religions are Christianity and Islam.
Yeah.
So people are generally quite open and bold about their faith. So I'll give you an example. I've been in high stakes leadership meetings where there's an opening prayer that is taken by a Christian and a closing prayer that is taken by a Muslim. So I think that in itself presents other kinds of challenges, but here people are generally open about their faith to varying degrees.
That's an interesting point. Aramide, is it there's some of the same thing in your organizations?
Yes, very similar to Chi as well. Worked in the West where you were a Christian or are a Christian, but don't necessarily talk about it. I think now there's this whole advent, like this KPMG has a Christian community. I think back then there wasn't anything like that, so I recognize that. But Nigeria, my country is very religious. Having said that, I've met a lot of Christians even today who, as much as religion is, it just goes with it's part of being a Nigerian, whether you're Christian or Muslim or whatever. A lot of Christians have had difficulty in infusing certain beliefs into work and dealing with work, where there sometimes are even conflicts because, like she was mentioning, you're in a queue. should you should you stay in the queue, or should you get to the front to overcome the challenge of just wasting time, or should you pay this person this amount to get or maybe to fast track something that you're trying to get, as opposed to waiting and going through the process. And I still see a lot of Christians, we all go through that, where we're conflicted in a sense, because it's almost like, no, yeah, you're a Christian, we all know, but certain things just keep aside. You separate work and separate religion. Yeah, there's a time for Jesus and everything, but there's a time to use your senses, and sometimes even referencing what Jesus said, it'll be as wise as serpents, but as gentle as doves. But then being able to infuse the two and live a life of, okay, does this align with what God is saying, what God's purpose is? Will this glorify God? It's still a challenge for many Christians, I find. So being openly Christian, I don't think is the issue. It's really the living out the Christianity in the workplace is something that Christians continue to battle with, because countries like Nigeria or in developing nations, things aren't so easy. And so you find, oh, I can bypass this by just, getting one up, or cheating, if you want to say, even though you don't want to call it that, but that's what it is, or bribing in a sense, even though you don't want to call it that, but it's what it is, because it can be really challenging. That, okay, in Western countries, things happen on time. You're going to get a train. It's going to come at the time that it says.
Well,
in certain
hopefully.
developing countries, in developing countries, it's not always the case, and this, extends to every sphere. In a country like Nigeria, it's exciting, but it's also tough. So that daily challenge of living out one's Christian values is something that I'll say, even me, I'm still trying to sort of get to, because you tend to always ask yourself, okay, is this glorifying God? Or maybe even after the fact, then remember, oh, did it glorify God? Oh my goodness, God forgive me. So there have been instances like that, I'll admit. And so I think that yes, being religious is not the case, but really living out that Christ-likeness is tough in certain countries, but it's not impossible. We're beginning to see how there's people who teach about that, like, okay, being a Christ-like person in the marketplace, what does that mean? What does that look like when everybody's going this way? How do you go against the grain and still remain, even though it's just you? That's something that people are more open to, and now they realize, okay, one person done it, so I can do it. Before it was just you and you're the island, and it's strange or it's difficult, but now we're beginning to see examples, which is a good thing. It's refreshing.
It really is refreshing. And how do you think that, and again, it's all really fascinating stuff for, as I say, someone and other people on this webinar will have been exclusively based out here in the West. And it is really interesting to see that insight. And as you say, that daily struggle, a lot of us in the Western world will take that for granted, right? And again, it's a really, really interesting point that you made, Dan. I'm glad that you did. And I guess one question maybe we'll keep with you, Aramide. Like if you're both so fascinating because you've operated and lived in both of the Western culture and the African culture, right? And you've kind of like gone between the two. Like, would you maybe say like, is there key things that maybe like Western culture can take and kind of bring into what we're doing to can again the openness around Christianity people will find fascinating, right? And we'll find that that's the Muslim cross that's a different thing. We'll maybe part of that for now because I don't think that's a different thing people experience. But like, is there something that it could really kind of take away and sort of like learn from that experience and maybe bring back to the West? And sort of say like, is it the appreciative challenge? Is it the kind of like the open faithness? Like one thing that you'd find if you were to sort of position yourself back here in the West again, the things that you take back with you that people could maybe draw on your experience on?
I think that's a really great question. You get, especially when you live in the West and things work, sometimes the reliance on God is because things work, it's almost like, I can just, and so I don't know. I mean, I'm speaking for myself here, but I've
Please.
found that when things have not worked, especially when I've not lived in the West and I've had to rely on God, it's reminded me that, yeah, I've relied on God. And in fact, when she was talking, I looked up the scripture, Isaiah 30:21. Whether you turn to the right or to the left, your ears will hear, this is the way, walk in it. Sometimes I've had to, because you've had decisions where you don't really know which decision to take because it's a bit of a conundrum. In the West, things work, so yeah, just go with what works. But here, sometimes you've really had to rely rely on God, and so having that ingrained in my psyche and the way I do things means that even if I go back to the West, and as much as I can get things done with ease, I've begun to live out a lifestyle where there's that reliance. And I'm hoping that I don't get carried away because things work. I'd always rely on God every step of the way. But I think, yeah, that reliance on the Holy Spirit, asking His counsel, even when things are logical, right? Still, relying on Him. And I remember, I think maybe was it she or was it you at the start talking about direction. And I've had a lot of people speak to me about, okay, well, I don't know whether God is saying I should move here or move there. There was a whole wave when there was challenges with the infrastructure systems in Nigeria, like healthcare and education, and there was this whole brain drain and people moving, for example, emigrating to Canada, the UK, and then I have young people who are career people asking, oh, everybody's going, it makes sense. And then I think I got a message once that said, remember that Moses moved out of Egypt, but Joseph had to move into Egypt. So for everybody, it's not about what, society's doing or what everybody else is doing. It's really about what God's plan is for your life. And that speaks to purpose as well, which is, you can thrive even when there is challenges and difficulties, and that comes to reliance. It boils down to reliance, relying on God, as opposed to just going with what everyone says. So if I could bring that back to the West, in the same way, I would say reliance on God. Living outside of the West as well has taught me to rely on God even more. But even going back, you'll be surprised how much more clarity, how much more maybe open doors, miracles, impact you can make when you rely on God versus looking at what is logical. That's probably what I'll say to that.
It's a wonderful answer. Thank you. And I put you on the spot with that one because we didn't kind of prep your head. And you answered it wonderfully. So thank you for that. Chi, how about yourself?
In addition to what Aramide has said, I think that one of the things that I noticed working the first job I had, and the only Nigerian company that I've actually worked with, which required quite a bit of adjustment for me, having worked in the UK for close to 15 years, what was how the two different cultures interpret bringing your whole self to work. And how this impacts our ability to be open and transparent and bold about our faith. So in the African context, people, because it's not just that we're religious, people genuinely bring their whole self to work. And perhaps also because culturally, we don't have as sensitive or as polite a culture, which, by the way, has its pros and cons, right? Because it has its pros that, there's a strong sense of community. People, if they're sad, they're sad. If they've lost a parent, everyone in the office is turning up. If they have a birthday, people are at their house. We know what they eat. We know what they like, as opposed to in the West. And I shouldn't just say in the West, in the UK, actually, because I think some of these things were particularly exacerbated by the kind of industry I was in as well, which is being in investment banking, which is very commercially aggressive and very male dominated, and also has its own unique traits, even within the context of Western culture. So I think both sides have their pros and cons. So I'll give you an example and tell you an anecdotal story. I remember being in the office of one of my colleagues while I was in Lagos, who was Muslim, and we were literally in the middle of a work conversation or a meeting after she'd stepped out and come back in, and then she suddenly realized that someone had dropped a flyer on her table inviting her to church. And she got so upset because apparently this had happened numerous times that she walked straight into the deputy MD's office and then walked to HR. And it turned into a whole office conversation because, there was this conversation around trying to be more respectful of everybody's beliefs in a sense, which, again, on the flip side, in the West, you would find that politeness that we have in the culture means that people are naturally a bit more respectful of individual boundaries. So I think both sides have things to learn from one another. But if I was to speak specifically of something that we could import from what I saw on the ground here to the UK, it would be embracing more just community and a genuine sense of caring for one another and trying to get to know and understand one another, considering how much we actually spend at work in the office beyond just beers and bants, in a way, which is what we tend to lean into, which is fun, and we see it as something cultural, but even the non-Christian who's beering and bantering may have issues or may have stuff that they're going through that they're just not talking about at work. So that would be one of the things that I would say, that is something that we can learn from one another.
Thank you for that. Yeah, agreed. Got a couple of questions that I think I wanted to leave a little bit of time to get to. One a little bit macro, one a bit more micro. Question, and Chi, this makes sense for you to take this one, but this is quite a wieldy question. I'm just going to answer it, and please try to box it in a way that makes sense for you and your experience. So, where do you think God is taking Nigeria into and its purpose in the world today, in the grand scheme of things? Question mark. That is an incredibly large question, but your short and personal just take on that would be really appreciated.
So naturally, I'm biased because I am a
Well,
Nigerian.
yeah.
I am a Nigerian who cares deeply about the continent and about Nigeria.
Yeah.
I genuinely personally believe that we are a unique people. I genuinely personally believe that we are very gifted. I think that we are, gifted based on just normal statistical distribution of talent, skills, issues, and everything, because there's just based on pure statistics, there are just so many of us. We are 220 million. So the chances that some of the most intelligent, some of the fastest, some of the change makers, some of the best of everything can be found within that pool. But I also, in many ways, think that there are many qualities, just our doggedness, our resilience, our positivity despite challenges. I mean, we're known as the people who will be suffering and smiling, for instance. I think a time, I don't necessarily know if the time is now, but I think a time is coming. I genuinely believe a time is coming. And I know that many people have, particularly my generation, have become increasingly cynical because inside and outside of the church, we've been saying a time is coming, a change is coming for many years. But again, my optimistic self is so were the Israelites. They also believed for many years, and then eventually it came. So I think God is taking Nigeria to a place where, because the kingdom needs people like us. The kingdom needs people who are bold and unapologetic about what they care about and what they believe in. And my belief is that we would eventually have our place on our stage. And my hope and prayer is that even in doing that, both in terms of economic, political, and social development, that the truth of the gospel and the word of God and faith continues to take forms the foundation of everything that we do across. So, I mentioned earlier on, for instance, that I have been pivoting from banking into media. And one of the reasons why I'm passionate about media is because in filmmaking and podcasts and these sort of things is because I genuinely believe that a lot of our identity and our perspectives of life, the world, and self is stems from the stories that we see and the stories that we're told from childhood all the way through to when we die. It informs so much of culture as well as we see it. So yeah, my genuine belief is that Nigeria across various sectors, media, economics, politics, will have a stage, and faith and Christian values will be at the center of that.
Amen, indeed. Amen. Right, a couple more questions. For those who feel like they're being called to work in Africa, let's pick on you two. What advice would you give in terms of positioning where to go seek out good opportunities? Fantastic question. Aramide, one for you.
Yeah, great question. I've come to learn more and more as I've matured that your network is probably more powerful than you think it is. So if you know that you're called to Africa, of course, you've established that, it aligns with God's purpose. And feel free to also lean on your community to get clarity and then pray and all that. But once you do that, I think the first place would be to lean into your network, especially if you have you're clear on the industry or the sector. I have friends who have probably never applied for roles or anything like that. They've always got jobs through a referral or a network. And I always would laugh when people said that, but I've seen it happen where, you just get referred and you just get referred. My first board position was someone who referred me. So I know that being called to work in Africa doesn't just mean a 9 to 5. It could mean other things. You could be called to set up a foundation or do media like Cheese doing. It would be good to lean into your network and find out, where the opportunities are. There are a few platforms like Move Me Back, which shares opportunities for diaspora Africans or diaspora people who want to move into Africa. There are and so that's jobs, opportunities, career type stuff. But there are many networks that one can lean into, and I found that that's probably been the quickest way to immerse oneself. Even moving into Cote d'Ivoire and not knowing, because of course it's a French country, trying to understand the system. I leverage my network, friends of friends, and that helped me ease into the system more. So I'll probably be, and that's maybe because I'm also someone who writes a little bit more networking, so I'm biased to that topic, but I'd say your network really helps. And then platforms online, looking at what opportunities there are. And then really just reflecting and doing that introspection as to the area, because you might find that there's people you can collaborate with. So it's not about just going something alone. You could find that there's partnerships you can establish or form that help you, where someone, what they're bringing complements what you have, and then it makes it easier. But of course, if God is with you, then the key thing is please take God with you and then go with Him along the way, all the way. But yeah, I think definitely your network for me.
Your network is your net worth, someone said once. No, incredibly valid. We've got time for one final question, quite a tactical one. So and whoever wants to jump in this one, grab it. My CTO is currently based in Ethiopia. What do you know about tech and government relationships in Ethiopia? Probably not a short answer. The plan is to have tech staff to build and maintain my project in Ethiopia because it's far cheaper. Where in Ethiopia, Addis Ababa is comparable. Where is Ethiopia, Addis Ababa in comparison to Lagos Tech? And where, in your opinion, is the best African city? Appreciate they're going to be biased, all right, based on where they live. But yeah, try and answer that question anyway. Whoever wants to grab it.
Do you want to go, Chi? Or should
Sure,
I?
I can.
Yeah.
I'll work backwards.
Yeah.
If I had to pick on this one, I'm not sure my bias helps me. If I had to pick an African country, to start, I would say, a more conservative entry point would be probably Nairobi,
Nairobi.
or Cape Town, or Johannesburg in South Africa. And I've picked English-speaking countries with decent infrastructure, with some tourism, not too much chaos like you have in Lagos. I mean, I would say Lagos, but Lagos is not for every and any type of person because it's immensely chaotic.
You've got to
So
be
I
built for it. You've got to be built for it, is what you're trying to say.
Exactly. I think
Yeah,
there are
yeah,
certain
okay.
personalities. The market is much bigger and the access is much bigger in Lagos for sure. And then, of course, in countries like Egypt and even Senegal, that has seen a lot of growth in recent years, you might have the language barrier. So if you're French speaking, yeah, Senegal or Cote d'Ivoire. If you speak Arabic, I would probably say Egypt or perhaps Morocco. Or even Tunisia, but the most gentle, what we like to call soft landing entry point, I would say, is Nairobi or Cape Town. And Ethiopia specifically, I haven't tracked it. I actually used to advise a client in Ethiopia about 5 or so years ago, and they went through a period of unrest where they closed the economy, and I haven't followed it closely since then. So I would leave that as my homework to go and catch up on what's going on in Ethiopia.
Always important to have homework. Okay, so let's leave it there. We're coming to an end anyway, but we want to thank both our speakers today. I've learned an absolute ton, and I'm sure everyone has here and who's watching back on video as well. And you've both done a brilliant job of trying to cover a whole continent amongst two people, but you've done a brilliant job despite that anyway. So we really thank you for your time, and I found both of your stories really inspirational for me. So I want to thank you both for taking the time to do that, and me getting to sorry, getting to know you both a little bit better as well. So that's been comforting. So thanks so
Thank
much
you.
for being part of it. Thanks for everyone that's participated. Remember, like, subscribe, leave a comment, all that type of stuff. Again, what these folks are doing is really important. So help them spread their words and spread their messages out there. And we'll see you at the next webinar. Thanks so much, and we'll see you
Thank
next.
you. Thanks so much.
Thank you, James. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.